technical things up. So can you all see my screen on presentation mode?
Yes, we can say that.
Okay, perfect. Fantastic. Well, yeah, thank you very much. I'm really excited to be able to present this. And thanks for the introduction. It always sounds strange to hear your own life and career being explained by someone else. So yeah, this is what I'm going to be showing to you today is some of the work that I did as part of my PhD, which I finished about a year ago now. And since then, as you said, I've been working with Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières. And so, yes, this work is going to be, as I will show you, published hopefully very soon. And it will be open access, both the code and the data. So hopefully hearing about it might also, maybe you can find a use case for your own research. So basically what I'll be talking about today is about temperature. Why do we care about temperature? And a new model that we use to develop high spatial temporal resolution temperature data for the city of Sao Paulo. I've divided it in 3 sections. The first one is the modeling of temperature. The second one is kind of a use case of how this temperature can be used. And the third one is I'll give you a couple of links to where you can access the data and the code. So let's get into the modeling. A little bit of rationale, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think most of people in the room are probably quite familiar with this, but why do we want high spatial temporal resolution data sets for health analysis, and specifically talking about heat? It's because we know from different we know from ground measurements that the temperature, especially in cities, varies quite substantially between one neighborhood and another neighborhood. And also it's quite substantial change between what you experience inside the city and in the surrounding areas. So in this diagram, for example, you can see the effect of the urban heat island. So that's the effect that you get when there's impervious surfaces and heat absorbing material being used and concentrated in cities. For example, the pavements or the building materials. These type of materials can absorb heat, which means that then this heat is being released in the environment, and that means that the temperatures that people experience inside the city are often a couple of degrees higher than what you would see in a suburban residential area or in the immediate surroundings, rural areas. But apart from this, which is well known and well reported, and you can find many studies that quantify these, the issue also is that within cities, we also see quite substantial differences. So you say neighborhoods, for example, that have a lot of green spaces might experience lower temperatures than neighborhoods that are in built-up areas and places devoted from blue or green spaces. Also, similarly, the type of materials used for the buildings might also impact this, as well as other features from the city, including, for example, wind tunnels that might make certain areas of the city receive a breeze from the sea, if the sea, for example, is nearby, as opposed to other places. So there is the hypothesis, and there is some supporting evidence to say that within cities, the temperature might change a couple of degrees as well from one location to another, which then poses the question of does that have an impact on the exposure that population get to heat? And most of the studies, epidemiological data that we have, which is a massive development, but in the recent years, we've moved from large regional to city level, thanks to a lot of consortium and collaborations across universities and cities, for example, the MCC or SALURBAL, who are doing city level studies, but still a lot of these data that we have so far relies on one meteorological station in the city, a couple of meteorological stations, or raster data that is usually quite coarse. So we're talking about several kilometers square of data. And that, of course, doesn't allow us to explore this idea that the temperatures might be different within a city. So that's a bit the justification of why would we want to look into developing this kind of temperature data set. And for my use case, I've used Sao Paulo. I've collaborated with the University of Sao Paulo with Professor Adelaida. So I'm really thankful for all their help. And one of the reasons why we picked Sao Paulo is because we had in mind that we wanted it to be, we wanted to prove that it was useful for epidemiological research. And Sao Paulo has really good health data sets, which are easily accessible, with a good coverage of the population. And we'll talk about it in the second section of this presentation. But that was one of the reasons. And the other one is because it's a megacity. It's the fourth most populous city in the world, with about 11.7 million people. It has a high prevalence of materials that are heat absorbing, so it's very built up. And so it is well reported that there is the heat island effect, and the city heats up substantially. There is, again, this is made worse by the higher rising buildings. We also have a quite distinctive distribution of the green spaces. So you'll have areas in the city where there are substantially large green spaces, as opposed to areas where there's none. And you can see here, for example, in this image at the back, the contrast of the high rising buildings and then some green spaces and the favelas, which is about 15% of the census are classified as informal settlements, or as they locally known, favelas. And these informal settlements, as you can see, are less structured. They don't have paved roads, and I'll come back to this, because keep that in mind, because it's important. And they have the materials they use for construction are different, so you can see it's a very distinctive setup. And also, I mean, we were concerned about it, and our collaborators as well, because as many cities as the world has been seeing an increase in temperature, and so temperature is becoming more of a concern for the population in Sao Paulo. So basically, this is just to say that we thought that there was a need for a high spatial-temporal resolution temperature data set. Mostly, we were creating it as a use case for the use in epidemiological studies. And we wanted to make it accessible for everyone. So that's exactly what we did. We basically developed a machine learning approach. We implemented a machine learning approach, a random forest, to try to do exactly that. This is a little bit the sort of approach, and I'm going to walk you through the different steps. So the first initial step is accessing the data, identifying your ground truth data, as well as your covariates or features, which in this case we've capitalized on the power of satellite and satellite-derived data, which provide you with high resolution information at a very fine resolution. And they're also accessible open access. And I keep saying open access because for us it was important to create a pipeline of work that allowed these to potentially be replicated somewhere else. So the idea was to use data sets and information that were open access and could be used in other locations. So once we have that information, there's of course a pre-processing that needs to be done, and some data cleaning and checks, to then be able to train the model. And as I mentioned before, we used a random forest, and we'll see a little bit why we did it and how we trained it, to then be able to obtain predictions. The predictions here, we're covering a period of between 2015 and 2019. We are producing daily rasters of data at a 500 meter square resolution. So just for you to have an idea. And then, of course, there needs to be a model evaluation. So if we get into the first step, which is the data processing. So here on panel A, you can see satellite imagery of the study area. And in this orange dashed line, you can see a box of our study area. So that's the area that we have modeled. And inside of it, you can see the municipality of Sao Paulo, and that's the area that we were interested to do the epidemiological study and for which we had the data. So we wanted to model a bounding box that would cover that location. The definition of this bounding box was also conditioned to the access, like to the availability of ground monitoring stations, which you can see here in the image in orange dots and red dots. And just, in the map on the right side, you can see the location of Sao Paulo, in case you were not familiar with it, which is in the coastal area in the southeast of Brazil. So the first step was to actually go out and fetch some ground monitoring data. We've initially obtained 60 different monitoring stations. And I don't say meteorological stations because what we did in order to maximize the number of stations is to also include air pollution monitoring stations. And that's because they also record temperature measurements as well as the air pollution measurements. And so that allowed us to actually expand quite a lot because there's not as many meteorological stations per se. So yeah, we obtained 60 meteorological stations from these 6 different networks. And here on this image, I just show you very quickly what it looked like. So in each of the rows, you can see the different stations, and then I color-coded the missingness percentage. You can see that anything before 2015 was very high in the percentage of missingness, and you can understand why we decided to focus on 2015 to 2019 as our study period, because the data before that was insufficient, and also you can't really see it here, but it was quite clustered in the regions that we would lose coverage. So we couldn't. We really couldn't use that kind of data set. So we focus on the period 2015 to 2019. And after doing the data cleaning, we excluded any station that had more than 25% of the data missing for the period. And then, of course, we did exploration about how this missing data was missing, whether it was missing at random or if there was a systematic bias, for example, but temporally or based on spatial location, and so on. And in all of those cases, the answer was that it was mostly missing at random, which was great. And that gave us a total of 43 stations that we included, with a total of 71,770 observations. So that's daily measurements for the entire data set. And here in this image, I just wanted to quickly show you a little bit, going back to the reason why we're doing this. And it's the idea that the temperature varies spatially. And you can see it very quickly just if you plot the average temperature, for example, for one specific day. You see in letter A, the figure A, you can see that the temperature varies up to 2 degrees between points that are actually quite close to each other. So 1, 2, or 3 degrees. And if we look at the distribution of temperature in plot B, what you can see, I plotted each of the lines represents the distribution of one of the stations. And in blue, you have the average. So if you were to use the average, you would be missing all this variability. And the same you can see over time, how the shaded area, which is all the values that you would obtain independently for each of the stations, as opposed to if you were using the average. So we're talking about a variation of up to 1 or 2 degrees spatially. As if you remember the initial diagram, apart from temperature data, of course, we need some other feature information. So what we did here is, based on the literature, we identified potential variables that could help us explain or predict the spatial and temporal distribution of the daily mean temperature. And also with the condition, as I said initially, that we wanted free and global data sets. So in total, we got access and identified 23 different features that we investigated. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they included things like green space indicators, or like blue space, like location of coastline, distance to the coastline, as well as land surface temperature, which is a key indicator, black sky albedo, wind direction, and so on. This is just so to reiterate that most, if not all of them, are satellite or satellite-derived products, so they have already a high spatial temporal resolution. This is just an example. And so now we already have, let's say, the input data, which includes both our ground truth, which is this network of 43 stations, together with this number 23 features that we have obtained. Now it's time to train the model. So we decided to use a random forest to do this this modeling. Random forests are ensemble machine learning algorithms, and basically they use decision trees. And you can see an example here on the right. They can work both for classification, so for classification tasks, but also for regression tasks. And basically, after all the different layers of trees, you then can aggregate your final output, and you can use an average to do so. The optimal decision for each tree is assessed through what it's called a loss function. And in our case, we're using RMC, the root mean square error. And the reason why we decided to use random forests is because they're quite good at handling nonlinearity. And we identified that as part of the pre-processing and data checks, a lot of these features, when we correlated them with temperature, they showed nonlinearity. Nonlinear association. So for us, it was important to allow for to pick a model that would have enough flexibility to allow to account for this nonlinearity without having to predefine it before. So, and that was one of the reasons. It also is been reported to be good to allow for complex interactions. So it can learn interactions between features and with your input variable, and also it works well when there's correlated predictors. So those were some of the reasons why we decided to use this method. You have to define certain parameters when you fit a random forest, including how many trees are you going to be using, how are you going to split the features, and how many layers of decision making are you going to put in each tree. Basically, those are, as you can imagine, quite key in defining the final result of the performance of your random forest. So it's very important to test different combination of parameters to identify which one is the optimal in order to make the task that you want it to make. So that's what's called hyperparameter tuning, because we're taking these hyperparameters and we're adjusting them and tuning them until we find the optimal. And you do this is part of the training, and you evaluate this with the loss function, as I said before. As part of this hyperparameter tuning, also, we included a selection of features. So of the 23 features, you're not using all of them, but you try to find, again, the best combination that allows for the optimal performance of the model. And I'm going to pay a bit more attention on this part and give you a bit more of detail, because we've used a method which is a bit different from other people. So maybe I'll do this first. Yeah. So when you want to train a model, imagine the top line is your entire data set. So imagine this 43 station data set, which has been linked with your feature information. So for each station, you have extracted every single day of information of each of the 23 features, right? And you have a massive data set with all this information. What we did then is we extracted what we call an external validation data set, or also known as holdout data set, which was a 5% of the total data set. And we did that based on stations. So we selected 5 stations at random that we would keep, and that are not seen by the model. This is quite important because a lot of papers also don't have it, and it allows you to have a completely external validation set. With the remaining 90% of data, which is this brighter blue, what we're going to do is train the model. And you can do this using cross-validation, which basically means you select, you can have, in this case, where I'm giving an example of tenfold cross-validation, but you can use different number. Each fold is a set of values, let's say, that you hold out, you train the model with the rest, and then you check if the model is able to predict what you had hold out. And you do these iteratively with 10 different groups of data. Normally, what is done is to use random folds. So basically, you pick a random combination of observations that you hold out, and then you test, and then hold out, and then you test, and so on and so forth. that's what we did differently here. We didn't use a random cross-validations, but instead what we did is we used a spatial cross-validation, which is a specific type of targeted cross-validation. And we did that because, Hannah Mayer in 2018 and colleagues published this very nice paper where they basically compared the different types of cross-validation and the impact that they had on model development in performance. And basically what we see is that the random cross-validation tends to give very optimistic, let's say, validation results. Whereas the target-oriented cross-validation tends to be much more conservative. And it's quite interesting as well, because if you think about it, if the objective of the model, which is our case, is to be really good at predicting at different locations, we need to define a type of validation that allows us to actually test this, which is, can I predict at a location where I didn't have information? Whereas if we do random, in this case with temperature, the temporal aspect is incredibly heavy, and it has so much weight on and it's a positive weight because it's much easier to predict the temporal than the spatial. So if we just pick at random, we're favoring much more the positive impact that it has be due to the temporal aspect. Whereas if we use a targeted cross-validation, which basically means that we are removing entire stations at random, what we are is actually testing what would be more in a real life setting and answering the question of, is the model performing well when it comes to predicting at a location where it has no information before or it hasn't seen the information before. So that's the justification of why we use the spatial cross-validation. And then another thing that was also actually raised by the same researcher, Hannah Mayer, is the issue with overfitting. And that happens quite a lot when you have temporally static variables. So that basically means that these variables that do not change over time, and you will see these in a lot of models. So models that include latitude and longitude, or variables that like elevation, which would make sense because elevation does have an impact on your temperature, right? But the issue with these, when you are developing a spatiotemporal model, is that these temporally static variables become like unique IDs to your location, which means that when you fit the model will learn that as a very strong link, and it becomes incredibly you end up overfitting basically. And what the issue is that a lot of the times when there is the feature selection, which is part of this training of the model, a lot of the times it uses what's called a recursive feature elimination. And the problem with this is that it normally uses this random cross-validation. And so you're not removing the variables that are overfitting the model. And so what they suggest is to use this forward feature selection, which basically initiates the model with two variables, and then it tests the performance of the model using a target-oriented cross-validation, which in our case, as I said before, we picked the spatial cross-validation. And it keeps adding variables iteratively until the model reaches an optimal performance. All right, so having said that, this is as well just an example of what it looks like. So we fitted all the variables, and basically you can see very quickly that most of them were not even selected. The yellow ones are the ones selected, and in each of these rows you can see the 3 hyperparameters that we tune and the different combinations. So we basically tested different combinations of hyperparameters with different combinations of the features using this forward feature selection. And basically what we saw is we picked the one with this one with the 15 maximum features, maximum depth, and a number of estimators of 1,000, which is based on the root mean square error. So this is, you can see the final variables that were selected. Sorry for not, I left the acronyms, but basically it's temperature from Aero 5 land surface temperature, dew temperature, relative humidity, wind direction, day length, solar zenith angle, and a second variable for wind. You can see that the one that explains the best the model performance, the one with the most importance, is the temperature variable from ERA 5 LAN. So that just to say that in this case, for example, for this specific case, out of the 23 variables that we explore, only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 actually were relevant for the prediction. All right, so now we have a model which has been trained and we're ready to make predictions. This is an example, a couple of screenshots of what the predictions look like. So you can see they cover the municipality of Sao Paulo in this bounding box that I showed you initially. And this is just an example of the hot months in 2015 and the cold months. So you can see there's a clear difference in the temperature range. And we're gonna now see a bit more what these predictions look like from a spatial perspective and from a temporal perspective, and see if they capture this variability. So in this image, I try to explain a little bit, also taking into account the geography of the area. For those who are not familiar, what are you seeing here? So the image in the middle is just the temperature of a specific day picked at random. And you can see that the temperature ranges between 17 degrees and 21, 22 degrees. You can see the bounding boxes. So in dark green at the top and at the bottom, we have large national parks and reserves. So you can imagine that we would expect the temperature to be lower, and the model is actually successfully predicting lower temperatures. Whereas in the city center, which I indicated here in a bright yellow with number 8, where we have most of the high-rising buildings, we see the temperatures are much higher, again, in line with what we expected. Whereas areas where we have more residential areas with quite a substantial proportion of green space, which I put here in this sort of beige color, number 9, have a slightly less temperature than the super build-up areas. Again, this is nice to see that it's able to capture this variability. And then in bright green, which you can see, it's hard to see at this resolution, but you can see little bubbles within very hot surroundings. These actually parks. There are actually 3 of the largest parks in the city. And so the model is also able to capture these parks, which is quite nice. And in bright blue, I've marked the 2 largest dams, or lakes almost, that are located in the sort of south of the municipality. And again, we can see that it's the model is showing lower temperatures, which we would expect with blue spaces. So in terms of the spatial component, actually, we are capturing quite nicely the variability between some of the major features of the city. When it comes to the temporal component, you can see here the variability of the predicted temperatures, and we're again capturing the seasonality of temperature in the region. And I've also, on the right, you can see it in the maps, so it changes quite a lot, the values. And also it's nice to see that we actually still can see the spatial variability within each month pretty well. For the years, again, it actually matches quite a lot with what we had from the records of like certain years being higher. So for example, in 2015, it was substantially hotter than 16, which the model was also predicting. I'm not predicting, estimating, sorry. So yeah, so those are the sort of main prediction values and outputs. But of course, we need to validate these, right? How good is the model at giving us this information? And I'm going to show you here a couple of products that a couple of tests that we perform. So the first one is just overall performance. As I said, we use spatial cross-validation. And the model showed an R-square of 0.95, which is quite high. And then on the right side, I've plotted for each of the stations their root mean square error. And we'll delve a little bit more onto these later on, because as you can see, the performance varies quite a lot across the different stations. If we look at the temporal component, that means like, are we performing, like, is the model performing better at certain moments of the year, for example, for some reason? What we can see is actually across the entire month, across the year, we do have quite good performance. Between 0.86 is the lowest to 0.93. But there are certain months that seems to struggle a bit more, like January, February, and March. But it is quite small, the difference. Again, here is what I was saying. So if we look at the spatial component, there is a little bit more of a difference. So you can see already on the map, and I highlighted the urban areas in this bubble. And when we separate and we do the cross-validation by classification of rural urban, we see that the urban performs much better. And this is expectable because, as you can see, the density of ground truth to train the model is much higher in urban settings than in rural settings. And I think this is important to bear in mind when using this data set, because you will have, we are less certain of our predictions in rural settings. And if you remember, I said we had this holdout data set or external validation data set that included five different stations. Here you can see the stations, and we plotted the observed and the predicted, observed in blue and predicted in yellow. And if we look at the R-square, again, the prediction is the performance is really good, 0.98 in most of the cases, except for these two. Where we have 0.81 and 86. And if we go back again to the same rationale I mentioned before, these two are classified as being in rural areas. So again, it makes sense that the model is performing slightly worse in these settings. So just to summarize, we showed that random forest can be used to predict temperature at a high spatiotemporal resolution using Sao Paulo as a case study. The strength is that we are using the data and the code will be hopefully very soon open access. That we're developing at a high spatiotemporal resolution, and it's using again satellite and satellite-derived data that is available globally and freely. Limitations, as I said, it performs worse in rural areas. So in terms of usability of the data set in those settings, we're less certain about the performance of the model. And then the other issue, which is well reported for random forest, is that they struggle extrapolating very extreme values. So if you train the sort of universe of values that they've seen in the training data set is what they will be able to extrapolate to predict. So if there was an unprecedented heat wave that would register values that have not been seen or the model has not been trained on, this type of approach would struggle to be able to predict that extreme value. There have been some advances in this front, and there's been some variations of random forest that explore how to address these, or the alternative is, of course, changing to another method. But it's worth mentioning for sure is if the aim of a project is very, very extreme, unprecedented values. And I don't know how I'm doing with time. I think I still have some minutes. So I just wanted to show very quickly. Okay, perfect. Just wanted is a small case of how this data set can be used. So we know that the impacts of heat on population are conditioned based on underlying vulnerability, and that can include things like medical conditions, but also your age, your access to resources, your income. But the sort of the evidence behind this information, as you can see, I just took this from a paper from 2012, but the amount of evidence and the level of agreement of these, how these different contextual but also individual factors influence the vulnerability of the population to experience heat impacts vary quite a lot. And this is for many reasons. There's less evidence coming from urban settings at this high spatial temporal resolution. And one of the reasons is because this kind of data, temperature data at this resolution, is lacking in many places. Also, this evidence comes from usually the global north. So there's also a bias into the type of determinants and context that this is being studied. And there's not much evidence that looks into contextual factors within cities, again, because of the complexity of the data that is needed. So this is what we were able to do thanks to the development of that data set that I just shared with you. So of course we needed some health data. So for that, we basically accessed the mortality data set for the municipality of Sao Paulo. We needed to have the data geocoded, which of course took quite a bit because it's not accessible readily geocoded. And we had to ask the CCUH, who are the owners of the data sets, to geocode it for us. They did it at the postal code to reduce the identifiability of the cases, but still give us some good spatial resolution. The data, the geocoding was actually surprisingly successful. We obtained an average of for the period 2015 to 2019. The success of geocoding was 95%, which is really high. So we were really happy about it. And the data included date, cause of death, of course, the geographic coordinates of the postal code, as well as individual demographic characteristics, which I'm going to show you now. For this study, we only looked at non-external causes of death and classified using the codes of the ICD-10 that goes from A00 to R99. And this is also important, only deaths from registered at the permanent residence. So it's not the place where they died or recently moved, is where they are registered as permanently residing there. These are the individual determinants that we used that were available from the mortality records. It included age group, sex, ethnic group, education, marital status, and occupation. And the classifications that we used is the ones that were given by the data provider. So, for example, the age groupings were already given, and the education years, as well as the ethnic groups. In terms of the contextual determinants, and that's the interesting thing as well, that we can do thanks to the fact that we have high resolution temperature data, is that we then can look at high resolution spatial data for contextual determinants and assign those to the mortality data. Here we looked at many others, but I'm just gonna share these three. We looked at rural and urban classification. We looked at the index of vulnerability, the IPBS, which was developed specifically for Sao Paulo. And we looked at land use classification, basically formal and informal. And here in yellow, you can see what it's classified as informal settings. I'm going to skip this. Of course, we had to basically link the data. So link the contextual factors with the temperature and the health data to obtain the final data set. To analyze it, we use a time-stratified case crossover. Basically, you treat each of your mortality death records as a case, and you create artificial controls for each of your cases. And the way you do this is you take asymmetric and bidirectional, so before and after of your death date, you create a matching control, and you match it based on characteristics of the person, age and sex, but also keeping matching also the day of the week and the month. By doing that, you're already adjusting for individual confounders. All right. So just to show you, basically, with this type of approach, you can obtain a curve that gives you an idea, like a curve between temperature and the risk. if we focus, for example, on figure B, you can see this is the classic behavior that we see for temperature mortality response curves, where you have a much longer extended curve on the left for cold and a much more abrupt increase for heat. When we look at the lag, so basically temperature doesn't impact on population immediately. You don't see the mortality effects immediately, but you see it in a couple of days later. And that's what we see in figure C. So you see that the highest impact is on the day after, and then it keeps dropping a little bit. Whereas for cold, it's quite different, where you actually, the first day you don't see much of effect, and you then have a peak a couple of days after, and the peak, well, the increase is sustained. It's very delayed, the impacts of cold temperature, and they expand up to 21, 24 in our case days. And just, I don't have much time, and I maybe I'll skip the individual ones and focus on the contextual ones, because that's the interesting thing that we can do thanks to this temperature data set, is that you can actually look at different contextual determinants and have a look and see if, when you look at grouping population by these different determinants, you see a difference in the impact. And I'm maybe gonna just, for example, if we focus on heat and we look at the informal settlement, we see that actually formal settlements have a higher risk of heat effects than informal settlements. And here I'll look back to the very beginning of my presentation when I told you, remember how these informal settlements look. And this is a quite novel, and I mean, the difference is quite minor. So we're exploring to see if we can actually find different classification of informal settlement, because this one is quite vague. But basically, most of the evidence from other countries, especially coming from Africa and India, show that the heat effects are higher in informal settlements. And that is usually attributed to the characteristics of the building materials that they're using, because they use a lot of metal sheets to create their shelters, their housing. If you remember the image at the very beginning, that is not the case in Sao Paulo, where they actually use brick or construction material. And actually, when you look at the type of material, it's less heat absorbing. They tend to have more green space built in the area, and also their roads are not paved, and pavements are quite heat absorbing. So the fact that we see a less heat effect in informal settlements for a place like Sao Paulo is quite interesting, and it could be showing that maybe this assumption that we've made based on evidence globally that informal settlements might be exposed to more heat might not necessarily be the case. But of course, this is a very small difference, and it needs much more it needs more research behind. And just to finish, as I said, the data will be accessible very soon. The paper is being submitted, so hopefully very soon. This is a website of the project, and if you go under project, you'll find the different sections that I've covered and access to the data and the code. And you can also find the code on my GitHub, which will be very soon available here. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Great, thank you so much, Aina. It was great to hear all of the many different things that you did. So if anyone has questions, please type them in the Q&A section of Zoom. There are already a couple there, so I'll start with those. First, Josiah Kephart is saying, thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I wonder if you have thoughts on whether it might be more appropriate when estimating intra-urban temperature to use a mechanistic approach where factors are determined based on existing knowledge versus your more data-driven ML approach based on the statistical contribution to the model. Thank you.
Yeah, no, 100%. Mechanical models, I think, are still gonna, in most cases, I would say, will perform better. I think it's just about the computational power. The data needed to run them, and the facility that you can have to actually make that accessible. So for us, we wanted something that could, the idea was also to check if it was, if it could predict well, because if the answer is no, then of course we need to go into more mechanistic approaches. But if our approach was, to try to minimize computational needs, minimize also data requirements and time needed for this type of mechanistic models. But yes, of course, I agree.
Thank you. Great. And related, second question says, I wonder if you think this data-driven approach could be applied to other cities using the same set of final predictors, or you think it will be necessary to select a new set of predictors for each city?
I think, and we've talked about it with you, I think, but yeah, I mean, it is possible, and I think it is possible to use this approach in other settings. I would say there is a need first to you have to run the model. You could start with a set of parameters as a starting point, but there is a need for validation. So the first thing you need to think about is, do I have enough ground truth in the location where I want to run this to be able to check if this model is working well? So say you want to run it for Mexico City, it's a complete different context. So we don't really know if this will work. Could work, yes. Maybe you could run it, but then let's have many ground monitoring stations that check if what we are predicting is making sense for Mexico, because maybe it's not. And if it's not, then we need to think about, do we need other features that maybe are relevant for Mexico City that are not for Sao Paulo City? Because remember that the model has been trained to learn the associations and the what's happening, the interactions and associations for Sao Paulo. But I think
Thank
that's
you.
true for the models. Yeah.
Thank you. So if anyone has any more questions, please type them in the Q&A. I do have one, which is going into your application to the health impacts. One of the things I saw in that table you show, I think was table 5.7, where you focus on the formal, but I went one line down and saw the urban-rural part.
Yeah.
And I think that part is fascinating because it shows that urban has lower risks due to cold and higher risks due to heat. Wonder if you could talk about that. I'm sure there is something very interesting behind that.
Yeah, so urban had significant, so it was lower for heat in rural, higher for urban. And then for cold effects, we had higher in rural, but it wasn't significant, and lower in urban. So, yeah, I mean, it could be, it's hard to tell, because if you think we're measuring outdoor temperatures, so that's another whole conversation to be had, because this is, and this applies to any heat study most of the times. So it's hard to understand as well whether that exposure is applicable to the people, and whether rural people people who live in rural areas maybe also have jobs that are exposed to more outdoor temperatures than people who live in urban settings. That could be one reason. But yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if one could say, I'm assuming a big difference between those two is the urban heat island effect. And
could be protected.
Exactly. One could argue the urban heat island
But
effect during the winter.
If you think about it, this is the cool thing about the temperature data set, is that should already be captured. So the exposure differential between one group and the other, in theory, if the model is good, of course this is not perfect and it will definitely be different, should already be accounting for this difference, right? So what's left is more other factors that are not differences in exposure. If the model,
I see. So since you are assigning the temperature, assuming the model works well, etc., that corresponds to that area, the urban heat island effect is already taken care of by the model. Yeah.
Should be already captured, which is why we were seeing in rural areas a couple of degrees lower in the images that I shown.
I see. Oh, very interesting. More questions by anyone? I have 1,000 questions written down. I can continue asking them. So another one I had, and this comes from an earlier webinar we had earlier or last year. We had Pablo Sarri-Colea from Universidad de Chile. And he was looking at this in Santiago. And one of the things I remember he mentioned, and I had never thought about that, is that the type of trees in each area actually may have an impact, because in the summer, where the foliage is higher, if the trees are of that kind, then they protect against the urban heat island effect. Well, in the winter, the falls are up, the leaves are up, so they don't protect against it, and that's beneficial. But if the trees are not of that type, that doesn't happen. And I don't know if that's something that is something accountable here. I mean, you did use green space, and I don't recall if it made it to the model at the end.
We used NDVI. It didn't make it to the model, and NDVI should be able to capture it. But again, the resolution, if we're talking about one tree in one street, you're not gonna see that. If we're talking about an entire park that has a type of perennial or non-perennial, like foliage, then maybe. But yeah, I think that, for example, going back to the first question, I think this kind of question can be answered much better by like mechanistic models that can model actually like the classic urban planning 3D models that can also take into account like when like the distribution of the street, the width of the street, is it locating facing north south to the winds, like is it a wind tunnel, are there trees, like this kind of more micro climate. I think that's where like I see an incredible value for mechanistic models, more like physics models.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I don't know if you have the link to the website that you mentioned, and you could drop that in the chat so that people can go there whenever data becomes available.
Right now it's not there, but it will be there.
Yep. Great. And I think it's also a good example of when it's there, data sharing and all of that, which I think is going to be key in the future.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Aina. It was great having you here. And thank you, all of you, for being here. We, just as a reminder, have a few events next month from the Climate Center, Drexel's Climate Center, and SALURBAL-Climate. On March 11th, we'll have an invited speaker, Jamie Madrigano from Johns Hopkins, will be coming to Drexel. We'll live stream the talk that she'll be giving. Sign up for the CCUH newsletter to get the information about that K-Lab. You can post the link to our website so people can go sign up. And then on the following day, on March 12th, we'll have Horacio Riojas from INSP in Mexico, also in that case giving a webinar, which I'm sure both of them will be very interesting. Again, thank you, Aina, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.